Like I mentioned earlier, a very interesting session, the personal touch, role models, resurgence of sustainable designs and rebuilding lives. Yes, this is a very special talk on smart green, and we'd like all of you to be a part of this. I'd like to request our guests at the back end of the hall to please remain seated. I'm now about to introduce to you our moderator of the session. It gives me immense pleasure to invite Ms. Ronitaa Dhanu, editor, Good Homes. Let's put our hands together for the lady who's behind the publication that focuses on the women of today seeking the best in decor, trends, ideas, and to become a leading decor and design magazine under her guidance. We welcome you, ma'am. I'd now like to welcome our panelists. I'd now like to welcome our panelists. Let's put our hands together as a welcome on stage, Ms. Tisca Chopra, actor and author. Let's also welcome Ms. Rina Kallat, renowned artist. A warm welcome to Mr. J. Mayer, founder and principal architect, J. Mayer and Partners. And I'd now like to hand over to our moderator. All yours.
Good afternoon, all of y'all. I'll take y'all through very quickly what we're planning to talk about, since it's an armchair discussion. So we've all talked about sustainable habitats. We've talked about the larger picture. What we're going to touch on right now is essentially individual role models, the role that each of us can play, the observations that each of us as individuals have made in our daily lives and what we've seen in our professional lives as well. So I'm going to start with you, Jürgen. My instinctive reaction for you is to ask you to connect what you see back home and what you see when you're here in our country. So if you can.
Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me? I don't think it's working. Hello? Is this working? No, this is working. Thanks so much for the invitation to come here today. And it's also fantastic to see a couple of these events already happening and me, kind of observing as a guest what the discussions are about sustainability in India. And I can bring, of course, some of the expertise from Europe and see, how certain aspects completely change the way we think about the future, how we communicate, how we move, how we consume. I remember in the 70s, and this is a couple of years ago, we were trained as citizens to separate waste. So we had to separate the glass from the plastics, from the paper, etc. Go actually to special containers in the streets and bring these wastes, to kind of have a certain reuse and recycling potential. Now this is of course in the country, everything, what we do and what we buy is like from supermarkets or from stores, but the crafts are changing in a different way. And I think what we have here in India is that automatically everything kind of has the potential to be recycled, being reused, being reinterpreted for new products without going through an intense industrial process. And I think that's something that has a lot of value and should be explored more. On the other hand, what I see also is questions of public space, which was mentioned earlier today, where the pedestrian value of an outdoor area is treated as a very important value, and the cars, at least in the European context, are pushed back as much as possible to allow a different street life again. That also, of course, helps local business, shops on the streets, markets, and also a certain mixed-use potential in the inner cities where living and working or living and shopping actually comes together. And this helps to somehow prevent a certain monoculture in areas where you might have dead zones in the evenings because the shops are or the businesses are closing down, or during the day where you have like empty areas because it's just housing and everybody's at work. So these are observations that I can share a little bit and which kind of affects the everyday life.
Nice. Rina, you want to add to this, since you also do travel a lot and a lot of your art reflects?
Well, I mean, you know, this is, say, nearly 2 decades ago when one would travel, you would see a lot of waste, since we're talking about waste. And that was something that one would be struck by, because there was an existing process of recycling which was so inherent in our culture, and which we in the last decades have seen eroding, because we're all adopting new lifestyles. And I would always be struck by how much waste is generated from one evening out, and the amounts, the quantities of food that's thrown. And that was not the case some years ago. And to just try and reconnect to, you know, things that already existed, where every morsel of food was well utilized. And you know, you go back to the villages and you see how they, you know, the plates are, you know, you're still eating in leaves. I mean, these are things we've just completely lost contact with, and trying to just learn from the intelligence of our existing systems. And that is definitely something that is the need of the hour, where we've come to a state, I mean, we all know that in the next 40 years, we're going to need 60% more food production, and how are we going to sort of face these challenges. So, I mean, to begin with, several corrective measures that we can take on an individual level for sure, but we can open the discussion further.
Yes, so Tisca, you were telling us about this ashram that you observed us at. You want to tell us more?
Yes, I'm going to hope, is this working? Can you hear me? Or is this better? That is better, both together. Good afternoon. And so we were having a chat briefly outside, and I was telling them several years ago, I get fed up of city life, so I escaped to some sort of place which seems to offer an alternative reality. And there's this place called Patti Kalyana, which is a couple of hours from here. It's in between Sonipat and Panipat, and there's a Gandhi ashram. Gandhiji's idea was that every village should have an ashram attached to it, which is essentially a lot of open space, which has some amount of produce, which is some fruit, some vegetables, stuff like that, an orphanage, and a chikitsale or a treatment center, where they use just hot and cold water, oil, mud, and sunlight to treat you. And it takes a long time. Of course, it's not as good as antibiotics, but it does work for people who can't afford it. So I spent about a week there, and it was very interesting because we started our day at 4 o'clock in the morning, and they'd get us amla juice. And then there was one newspaper, one single newspaper that would arrive, which was ordered by someone or asked for by someone. And that newspaper would be read by everybody, then sent back to my room, and then I would use it to peel whatever vegetables or fruit I was peeling, and use that to dunk the kachra in. And then the rest of the newspaper was used to wipe the dishes clean, wipe the floor, wipe whatever other surface. This was after everybody had read it. So to me, that was extremely green and extremely considerate. I think the whole idea of green, and since we're talking about personal, we're not talking about what government policy or what larger changes can be made. Though personally, if you ask me, I think we're well past the point where just saying, okay, I will drive a hybrid car and my own personal carbon footprint will be very small is not good enough. We're well past that point. The glaciers have melted, the oceans are boiling. It's now time to take hard, strong action on the international level. However, since we're talking about personal changes, I think that it's inspirational to go back to certain very basic ideas of what Rina was mentioning as well, which are very much existent in our Indian culture. Things like, you know, even I'm being an actor, I can talk about cosmetics and things like that. I try and use things that don't have CFC, but you know, use our lapes and our Indian stuff, natural stuff. So that's one way to go. The other thing is, which is, I don't know how many of you are aware that when you shoot, when there's a shoot, it's like a mini universe by itself. There's 150, 200 people at one time. And the amount of debris that they generate is unreal. So some of the more cool units decide to give these tiny bottles of Bisleri to everyone. Okay, everyone take your 10 bottles of Bisleri and drink it through the day and our problem is sorted. By the end of the day, 200 people with about 4 or 5 or 7 bottles, you can imagine what kind of waste that is, and that's just from water. So one of the units that I was working with, I suggested that why don't you have those 20-liter canisters and have paper cups instead of styrofoam cups. So, you know, basic things like that. One just starts suggesting better alternatives and work in a way that use the last 15 minutes of shoot. So we normally shoot in very scenic places which are beautiful and green, and the eco balance looks really fine, and then suddenly a film shoot arrives and it looks like, you can't even imagine what it looks like. It looks like a disaster. It looks like there's been a small typhoon there. So we use the last 15 minutes of shooting time to actually 200 people get together and we clean that up. Everybody sort of, and so you know that you have to do it at the end of the day, so then people don't end up littering that much. And we do segregation of garbage. Yeah, it's a start. It's a start. So everyone starts getting conscious, because it's a very androgynous sort of group of people. There's no homogeneity. So there's people who are not from all stratas of society. There's some people who are like the workers, the lightsmen and all. They're not very well educated. So for them, being green is not really a concept, right? But if you start introducing it in the workspace, then it hopefully will percolate.
It becomes a way of life.
Yeah, it can percolate down.
As well. Yeah. Jürgen, I'm going to come back to you. This is something that, you know, when I was doing my background work on some of the buildings, the projects that you all are working on right now, you've got the Rhine 740, which is the project that's going on, and you have the no air conditioning concept there. So tell us more, because that's really interesting. I mean, that is something that we're all, it's a dream.
Well, I think this is really dependent on in which climate you're building, and each area in the world, of course, needs separate regulations or separate technological possibilities. In Germany, we're still not such a hot country. It's getting hotter, but it's still a very moderate climate. So we're trying to avoid a high input of technology in terms of building technologies in order to create a certain, let's say, more comfortable climate or comfortable atmosphere. I personally, I'm kind of sensitive to air conditioning, and I'm sure a lot of people, you know, easily get maybe colds or they don't feel so comfortable. You know, the air is kind of processed, and if there's a certain, let's say, use of outdoor air that you can make comfortable for the interior, then I think that's quite an advantage. What we can do in our climate is to have a certain cooling factor of the spaces by running water pipes of cool water in the ceilings, mostly if it's kind of a concrete ceiling, that works really well. At the same time, we have double window systems where you have an outer window that is more for wind and rain protection, but still allows a certain air circulation, and then there's, of course, the insulated window. So in the nighttime, you can actually open the window, the interior window, and allow the night air to cool off the space. And if you have a certain solid mass in the building itself or in the rooms, for example, a concrete ceiling, that can store the coolness of the night, which then radiates out during the day. So you have to maybe consider not only the performance of the minute or of the moment that a building or a room works, but the whole cycle of the day, the night and day cycle, and make use of that. On the other hand, of course, if you have green roofs, that might be a cooling factor for the building, but more efficiently for a global anti-warming strategy, it would be helpful to have white roofs, which is just basically a white color which reflects the radiation back into the universe. That might be more effective maybe than the green roof, greenwashing strategy that we have so far.
Okay. To bring it down to a micro level, so this is one big project that we're talking about. I realize that our country is not too suitable. I mean, the climate is not too conducive to doing that, but there are a few places that we can kind of start using that sort of base. So on a micro level, do you think that would work if we tried something like that in our homes?
I think in our homes, air conditioning is less an issue, but also if we are not expecting that we have this constant comfort zone everywhere, which is, I don't know, maybe 18 degrees Celsius or 20 degrees Celsius, but to also allow our body to go with the biorhythm, going with the weather, with the seasons, and allowing to kind of be dynamic with the cycle of the year, then we might understand let's say climate not as a threat, but as part of an activation of our bodies.
Okay, so now I'm going to basically throw this open to the two of you, because if we're talking role models, then it's Tisca, you and Rina, both of you, because you all are out there interacting with, not so much interacting, but out there in front of the public. So I'm not going to structure it too much, but tell us your thoughts, just basically what you do, how would you like to start, and the train of thought that you'd like to kind of ignite out there.
I mean, taking off from some of the discussions in the previous panel where there were concerns about public space. I mean, living in a city like Mumbai, you know, there is really no concept of making space for the public. It's really, you know, people finding, there aren't really places that are conducive for people to spend time, or the magnetism of, say, cities like Chicago, where perhaps art in some way becomes like the center of the city and people come together. And in Bombay, you know, we've had, at least in certain localities, the ALMs, the local management, which are initiatives by people who have come together to sort of salvage the promenades and build the promenades along the seafront. And those have really played a role in finding, like making place for people to walk in a city that completely disregards the pedestrian. And so those kinds of initiatives, which are really on a personal, individual level, collectively coming together on a local level, not really top-down approach, but, and those kinds of initiatives are something that we can build on. I mean, there have been several other proposals which, of course, need to be sanctioned, state sanctioned, but the Greenway project or the Bombay Greenway project, or, you know, you think of the High Line in New York, and that has really transformed the way people move and access the city. And there is definitely scope for a lot that one can do.
I think communities are being formed along the way, and those are kind of mobilizing a lot of changes, however small, but...
Like, just to give you an example, I was in Vancouver for this project that opened in May and was up until October, out in public space. And this was a project by the Vancouver Art Gallery, which is the museum in Vancouver. And looking at installing a piece outdoor for people to come interact with is something that I think not only lends something to the art, but also sort of, in a way, has a transformative role in terms of how people access and interact with the piece. So, I mean, one other example was at the Bhaudaji Art Museum, which is, we have very, very few institutional spaces in this country, as we know. So, to really try and find a space for the arts in public, you know, domain is not something that you know, you have a very, very good art gallery scene, private gallery scene that have been rigorous and, you know, have created that platform. But to have these vast masses in a city of 20 million, to not be able to speak with that mass audience is something that as an artist you really feel a sense of, you know, something that you lack and you want to connect to. Sorry.
You know, there's a Japanese Buddhism, there's an expression in that, it's called Ishofuni, which means oneness of life and environment, wherein it is very beautifully explained that the human body is a microcosm, and the planet outside and the larger cosmos is an extension of that. It's the macrocosm. So they've drawn parallels between the way our blood streams are to the rivers, to the hair on our head is like forested areas. You know, so they've drawn parallels between the human body and the environment. And they go so far as to say that hurting the environment is, in a way, you don't realize it because it's slightly out there, is like chopping off a finger or a toe. And actually, as we're seeing what's happening, our lungs are going, our, you know, has anybody experienced that they're having to take 2 courses of antibiotics to get rid of that cold, which earlier used to be sorted out with like a kadha, which be taken care of, but now you're having to take 2 courses of antibiotics to cure that one single cold. It's mutating and things are going all over the place. So I think it's just the environment telling us that get it together. I'm a very firm believer in understanding this concept that this is not out there, it's not for somebody else. You're doing it for yourself. And I think not looking after the environment comes essentially from an ego-driven space. I will sit in my 6-7-seater SUV and drive because I can, rather than carpooling or, you know, taking public transport or whatever else. It comes from a desire to be elite and exclusive. And I think there's a lot of that in India. If you can, you will. You will not restrain because that's smarter to do. So that's an idea that I'd like to introduce into public space. I write occasionally, so, you know, I've started writing about this. I started speaking about it. On shoots and places like that, it's, you know, we have these large vanity vans, these caravans that we use. And an actor gets, it's the size of about the size of a stage. It's that big. It has a toilet, it has a drawing room, it has a sleeping area and a makeup area. And I've started to say, no, I don't want a vanity van. If you have a makeup room, then I can put the fan on and that's fine. So I'm not consuming petrol because it's on the whole day. It's just a stationary truck which is standing the whole day burning, guzzling fuel. So, you know, it's small things like that, or 2 actors end up sharing a place, or, you know, stuff like that. So it's very, very, very simple, basic things which you think about and try and put out there, saying it's for this reason that it's for this reason that I'm not going to do this. And initially there were a few snickers that really, you think it's going to make a difference? You know, there was that kind of a thought process. However, slowly I think a lot of actors are now cycling to work. People are trying to use different, you know, different ways to get this. We don't have pavements in Bombay, so nobody can walk. You have the risk of being run over. So, yeah, these are certain things that we need to put into our public domain. Yeah. The other thing which I wanted to talk about was, as Rina was saying, artists are always inspired by nature. It's the original source of inspiration. Anytime you feel that the city is really getting to you, you step out to be near the ocean or you go into the mountains, and there's something which comes to you which responds from your innermost soul to that organic, wonderful, natural thing that you are, and that is outside, is in you as well. That disconnect, particularly in Bombay, it's very suffocating. I love walking, but there isn't a space where you can happily walk. However, on the other side, there are a lot of people who are fighting for the mangroves, which are what sustain Bombay and keep it reasonably, despite the pollution and the, you know, number of vehicles and air conditioning in massive building complexes and all of that. It's still not so bad. The saving, and also sea air washes it all away. But there are a lot of people, including some actors, who do end up speaking for saving the mangroves. So things are happening, but I think it's a little slow. We've not really taken it all that seriously, as the West has woken up to it. And we're just going ahead, doing what we have to do, without really taking concrete steps. And that's troublesome, because we're cutting off our own toes and we're not realizing it.
So, incidentally, Rina does a lot of work with salt. You have to speak about it, because that is one thing that kind of not only connects with what Tisca just said, but it's also a comment, it's your comment on where we're going and the connection of the individual with the ocean. So,
Well, this was a project that was initiated in Korea, and it was a large sculpture outdoor. What I'd proposed was a text which was by Marcel Proust, and which said, "A change in weather is sufficient to recreate the world and ourselves," which was meant to be grown in grass with this large sculptural stamp, and the print of that was to be grown. And when the sculpture got moved indoors, I just thought it lost meaning completely. And I had to keep thinking of how would I take the print outdoors, and I then thought of salt as an element of sustenance, one that extends life as a preservative. And I carried the text at various sites. This was at a Buddhist site called the Hainsa in Korea, up in the hills, and had 1,000 years of having preserved the original Tripitaka Koreana text. And from there on, I mean, I began writing these texts, and people just joined in, which was not really intended. And it just sort of brought in people who came in to write the text with me, because there was a language barrier, and I thought that was so beautiful. And my association with salt, I was constantly thinking about its connotations in Christianity, in Buddhism, to ward off evil, and Christianity for purity, permanence. But they instantly connected to Gandhi's usage of salt, having come from India, and they kept saying, while a pinch of salt brought down an empire. And this was a kind of resistance towards forgetting, where I began re-evoking texts, and then taking it to the beach, where these texts written in salt appear and disappear, sort of manifest and then disappear, return back into the ocean. And I was sort of drawing these connections between the salinity levels of the body and those of the oceans, having come from the Precambrian seas. And so that's an ongoing body of work that I've been doing with salt,
yes.
with several women writers, poets, whose
Yeah, one of my favorites, one of my favorites. So I'd like to throw this actually open to all of you, because yes, a lot of us, in fact, most of us here are professionals, and we're professionally dealing with this issue constantly. But as individual role models, as microcosms in your own world, what is it that you guys think we can do as individuals? So can someone pass out the mics?
Hello. Thank you, madam. And we have people, eminent, it's spoken very nicely. What I feel that in a rapid industrialization of this time, which is happening very fast, the priorities are set upon making careers, making money, making something, and to know something better. How do you inculcate these feelings amongst the younger generation? That is more important, because if you live a life to build a green, sustainable life, you have to inculcate in your children. But we are there to make their careers and everything. So how can we inculcate those young kids and to make our style of living in such a way that they automatically learn these lessons? So is there anything which you want, because now the ball is in your, court.
Maybe we can have 2 or 3 questions and then joint answers. I think that might be
So we round that up when we're concluding this.
Can you hear me? Okay. I think it's, thank you for the very interesting discussion. I think it's, we should really make people aware of the fact, like, it's, people would be a lot more happier in buildings where they are able to adapt, and where there is flexibility in the spaces, where they can adapt based on seasonal and daily variations in climate, rather than being in a 24-hour air-conditioned building where they are a mere recipient of the external environment. As an architect, the kind of brief that we get while designing buildings is that we want an air-conditioned building. We are not even exploring the option of going in for natural ventilation or a mixed mode. For example, if we're sitting in Bangalore where there is pretty moderate climate, not as extreme as Delhi, but still we are designing buildings which are 24-hour air conditioned. So I think this change in the thinking of people, and especially clients or people, that we don't need a constant 24-hour air conditioning. It's okay to be sometimes hot, or you're able to flexibly change or adapt to the external climate. So I think that is something that we can do as building professionals who know about what is the importance of living in a sustainable manner.
Can I answer? I think when we talk about sustainability, we have to consider not only the ecological issues, which means climate. Sustainability only works if at least 5 points are considered. One is the socio-cultural aspect. But if you're building, what is the effect on the society, on the community around you? The more we are creating spaces that allow for communication, that allow for gathering, that allow for a certain, let's say, public space experience, the better. We have to consider cultural issues. If we are living in and consuming and producing, it should be something that really celebrates the heritage that we have and also looks into the future. It has to work economically, because if we don't make money, we cannot reinvest. So also that's a dead end. And of course, to push kind of the knowledge and create solutions that might help to also transfer these ideas to other places, then we also gain more. So the ecological part is only one aspect, but it's actually something that needs to be considered more universally. And I just came back last week from a conference on timber construction in Kuala Lumpur, which is looking into expanding the markets, of course, for timber from Malaysia into the world. Mostly European architects and engineers were invited to talk about their experience and create a certain exchange. Timber is really interesting because you can do very solid buildings, but it captures a lot of CO2 and therefore takes what we put into the air back into construction. Also, when you look into fire issues, if you use solid timber, then when it burns, you create a certain crust that's coal, but it protects the inner part of the timber and stays stable. While if you look into steel and and even concrete, the steel is going to melt and the buildings become kind of soft. So there are new ways of thinking about how we actually can do something on a very kind of everyday level, and it starts with construction. That's one of the serious issues and the biggest pollution producers when it comes to our ecological disasters. And there's a lot to do, and timber might be one of the solutions.
So in fact, that's a subject that actually I wanted to touch upon while concluding, considering we've got a room full of influencers. It's a vow that needs to happen here at this level, because there's a lot of opinions, there's a lot of desires that you all can influence when you all are dealing directly with, like you rightly stated. The change needs to come from here. If you suggest it, you'll start the thinking ball rolling, and I think that's what it's important. People on an individual level need to start thinking about it. Only when that happens will the change happen. So it needs to start here, and I hope you all do. So with that, thank you all so much. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so very much, ma'am. Like you said, that there is a room full of opinions, and we'd like to request all of you who'd like to share their opinions and ask questions. You're more than welcome to do that during lunch hour. They'll all be here. They'll be joining us for the same. To thank each one of our panelists and our moderator, I'd like to invite on stage Mr. Raju from Saint-Gobain, and also joining us on stage is Mr. Rishi Kapoor. Let's put our hands together as the gentlemen step on stage. I know it's lunch hour, but we have more energy than that. I promise you a fantastic lunch right after this. Thank you so very much. A Smart Green certificate for you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for joining us, Ms. Tisca Chopra. Let's put our hands together as we present her with a memento. Thank you so very much, Ms. Rina Kallat. I'd like to thank our panelists, Mr. J. Mayor. Thank you so very much, sir. Once again, let's put our hands together for our moderator, Ms. Dhanu. May I request all of you to join us for a group picture?